on the holiness of God in the book of Leviticus. I think there's a need for a church to hear the Lord say, I, the Lord God, am a holy God. And to hear the very next statement from that holy God say to his own people, so be ye holy, for I, the Lord God, am holy. We need to hear the Lord tell us that. And there's no other book in the Bible that more clearly challenges us to holiness, I think, than this book written to the Levites to instruct them on the worship of a holy God. So by God's grace, we'll give that consideration today and in the Sundays following. Titled this morning, The Way to God, Access Open. Have you ever been denied access to something? Somebody, actually told you, I'm sorry, you're not allowed in. You say, well, that's discrimination. That's not right. Oh, I'm sorry. Unless you have the right access code, you don't get in. If you don't have the right password, you don't log in. If you don't have the right ticket, you don't get to experience it. Admission or access denied. Now, if you have the ticket, if you have the passcode, if you have the admission, what a joy. You get to walk up and you get to flash your badge and you get to continue on in and you get to experience whatever it is that everybody on the outside who didn't have the ticket, they don't get to experience. But you do because you have access. I remember in high school, I was on the yearbook staff my senior year, and I was the photographer for my yearbook staff. It was a pretty pathetic yearbook, to be honest. I wasn't the best photographer, but that year, I think George Bush Sr. was running for president. Tells you how old I was in high school. And he came to Springfield, and I secured a press pass. And I got to go to Hammond Student Center and be with the press. I mean, like I was as close to the president as Dan is to me. I was right down front, and he came in that huge Coliseum, that huge arena there in Springfield, probably the biggest arena in Springfield at the time, and it was packed with people, and I had my camera, and I was clicking away because I had admission to that very select region on the floor. I had that press pass, and I was admitted. All the other students from my school who came, all the other individuals from the yearbook staff who came, who didn't have the press pass, they were way back up in the balcony. I took my zoom lens and zoomed in on them. I still couldn't see them, right? I mean, that's how far away they were, but I had access. I was pretty special. I wanted to brag about that, so I left that area during the middle of the speech because I was a high schooler. I wasn't really too concerned with what he was saying, right? I just had access. And so I went up and I found my group, and I was bragging about how close I was in the press pass and what he got me access to, and I came back down and tried to get back in that spot. Well, the Secret Service were now there, and they didn't care I had a press pass. I wasn't going to interrupt the president. I wasn't going to make my way back in there. So, access denied, right? I might have had a ticket, but I didn't have the security clearance that the Secret Service wanted for me to have now that the president was actually up speaking. Well, you kind of get the idea of access. Yeah, you go on a family vacation, which I was recently on a family vacation, and a lot of the things that a convention visitors bureau wants you to be aware of often charges admission. There's a ticket, there's a price, there's a cost. And so having recently come off vacation, there were various venues my family and I went to where we had to have a ticket. Before we could experience the joys of, let's say, Colonial Williamsburg, we had to go to the visitor center and get our family tickets, and we had to wear them around our neck. And so every place we went there in the colonial area to experience our American history culture, we had to show that we had a ticket that gained us admission. Now, any of you could have joined me on that street in Colonial Williamsburg. It's an open street. You can walk up and down the street, and you don't need permission to be on the street. But if you're going to enjoy any of the historic events that take place inside a building, it requires an admission ticket. And while we were there, we saw people who were denied entrance because they didn't go to the visitor center and gain that ticket. Well, the issue before us today is not access to a political event or access while we're on family vacation. What's at issue before us today in the book of Leviticus is our access to God. Access to God. Do we have the right to come before God? Do we have the right to gain an audience with God? And the opening chapters of the book of Leviticus explains that access to God was both gained and maintained through various offerings that the nation would bring to the temple. There was none more important than the very first offering that's explained to us in Leviticus chapter 1. Now, from chapter 1 through chapter 7, there's at least 5 different ones. There was the burnt offering that we'll discover today or talk about today. And that was the most important one. And the reason it was the most important one is because if you wanted to approach God at all, you had to bring a burnt offering. The burnt offerings were offered by the priests every morning and every evening, twice on the Sabbath day. Any festival of the nation, there were multiple burnt offerings offered on top of the other number of offerings that were suggested and required as part of that given festival. But you as an individual, if you wanted access to God, if you wanted to worship God, if you wanted to have a right relationship with God, you as a member of the community had to bring a burnt offering to the temple to gain access, or we could even say it this way, to have fellowship with God. So the context of Leviticus chapter number 1, as it begins to talk about sacrifice, it says in verse 1 and 2, just reading this, and it will set the context for our study this morning. The Lord called unto Moses and spake unto him out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, If any man of you bring an offering unto the Lord, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd of the flock. So the original audience, beginning to hear Moses speak the words of the law here in the book of Leviticus, both from his mouth, which was then probably penned by somebody who heard Moses retell what God was saying, would not have been shocked at the ritual of bringing a sacrificial offering from their cattle or from their flock. That wouldn't have been a kind of a strange thing. In fact, the offering of sacrifices to the Lord had been a significant part of the storyline of the Bible to this point. So as we drop into Leviticus number 1, let's consider this concept of sacrifice in the Bible. It goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve were commanded to not eat of the certain tree. And the Lord said, the day you eat of that tree, you will surely die. And in Genesis chapter 3, as God is confronting Adam and Eve, he's challenging them, and they're aware of their sin, and he's aware of their sin, and he knows he has to deal with their sin. They had a covering of leaves, but God made them a covering of skin. Now, it's not stated in Genesis chapter 3 that an animal died, but the original audience that heard that would have understood that death occurred and a skin was provided by an animal to provide the covering. So a sacrifice isn't stated, but it's implied all the way back as early as Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 4, sacrifice and bringing an offering is front and center. I mean, right at the get-go of Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel was all about how somebody approached God. Would they approach God based on the way he directed or with the heart that was honoring, or would they do their own thing? And God accepted one offering that was brought, and he didn't accept the other offering that was brought. And there's various reasons that people give as to why Abel's offering was accepted and Cain's wasn't. It's assumed by most people, as we look back, understanding the issue of the importance of the sacrifice and life was in the blood, that the reason that Cain's offering wasn't accepted was because it was a vegetable offering rather than a blood offering. But we even see in the law that God accepts offerings of the ground, of grain and so forth. So it wasn't necessarily that God didn't accept the offering because it was a vegetable offering. It was the heart that God rejected in Cain. And God didn't accept his offering because, though he went through this ritual, it didn't mean anything. He wasn't really committing himself to God in that offering. Genesis chapter 8, after God brought judgment on this world through a worldwide flood, we do believe that's a literal story in Genesis, and Noah and his family lived through it on a literal boat, a literal ark. And we believe the Word of God in that regard, that Noah offered significant sacrifices. Once he got out and he was on dry land, there was a number of sacrifices of thanksgiving that he offered to God, saying, "Thank you, God, for sparing us from the destruction." It was a demonstration of appreciation to God for that. The father of the Hebrew people, the people that Moses is speaking to, Abraham, was somebody who was known for building altars. And as he went in various places, he erected altars. And that's what the Genesis story tells us. Why did he erect altars? Just to erect an altar? No. It was because he was worshiping God by slaying animals and demonstrating his allegiance to the Lord in the erecting of the altars. The most significant altar he erected is found in Genesis 22 on Mount Moriah, when Abraham, under the direction of the Lord, offered up his son Isaac. And really what was being sacrificed there was not so much Isaac as it was Abraham's heart, his love. The test for Abraham was this: Abraham, who do you love more? What do you love more? Your son or your God who gave you your son? Abraham passed that test. He demonstrated his allegiance was with God rather than preserving his own son's life. So God said, "Oh, wait a second, Abraham. I've seen it. You've demonstrated what you're willing to sacrifice to worship me, to have a relationship and fellowship with me. That ram caught in the thicket, it'll do just fine. Take its life instead, because you've demonstrated that I'm supreme in your heart." What a wonderful story Genesis 22 gives us about sacrifice. I'm sure the Hebrew people would have maybe even had that on their minds as they're hearing instruction in Leviticus about offering up these offerings. Jacob built altars at Bethel. He built an altar at Beersheba on his way down to Egypt because his son Joseph was alive at the end of his age, and he offered there worship and offerings and sacrifice to the Lord. Several hundred years later, in servitude in Egypt, Moses asked Pharaoh, "I'm going to take God's people, we're going to go 3 days in the wilderness, and we're going to offer offerings. We're going to worship our God." We accept that He is our God. We, in a sense, by worshiping the God of our forefathers, we're demonstrating we are not Egyptians, and we're not worshiping the Egyptians' gods. And that was the very first request Moses had of Pharaoh. We want to go offer offerings in the wilderness. Now, these individuals hearing Moses in this story would have recognized that that was something that they did to connect with the God of their forefathers. They wouldn't have understood that necessarily as they slaved away in Egypt, but Moses is helping them begin to understand this concept. Certainly, after the Passover, God instituted the sacrifice of the Passover lamb annually as a festival to help them remember as a memorial what God did for them. So that's the context of, as we jump into Leviticus chapter number 1, these people would never before have, in a sense, approached God merely or solely on the access or through access of offerings, but it was a part of their culture, and it was a part of how other people worshiped their gods. Not necessarily in the same way, but the offering of offerings and burning of offerings. So that's helpful to understand. But there's something new that's taking place here in Leviticus, and we'll talk about that. The context of these individuals is that they understood limited things about God. They didn't know everything about God. They knew some things about God. But by the time the nation arrived at Mount Sinai for the giving of this covenant, the nation had already grown to know limited things about God. They knew this, that God could deliver them. God was strong. He was stronger than the Egyptians. They had fought against the Amalekites, and God had helped them win. Remember, when Moses' hands were lifted up, their armies prevailed. Why? Because their God was strong in battle. They understood that this God that they were entering this covenant with, it was a God who could provide for them. Moses brought water from a rock. God did that. They were hungry. This God brought bread and quail to them daily. They were learning this is a God who could provide. They understood that this was a God who kept His promise. He was a covenant-keeping God. They were in the process of learning that as they entered into this covenant. They certainly understood that this God was holy. As Moses went to receive the 10 Commandments back in Exodus, they're there at Mount Sinai, Moses instructed them, look, I'm on this mountain. There is smoke on this mountain. Don't let anybody touch this mountain. Don't let anybody walk up this mountain. I'm there on this mountain, Moses, and I'm interacting with you, Moses, but I'm a holy God, and not anything that comes to the mountain, because I'm a holy God, it'll die. So they're learning these things about God. Where were they? As we enter Leviticus, we find that the nation is still at Mount Sinai. They've received the 10 Commandments from God, but God is now giving them instruction on how to interact with Him. At the close of Exodus, they received instruction on how to build the tabernacle. That's awesome. If you looked at Leviticus 1, there at the very end of Exodus, chapter 40, verses 34 through 38, the tabernacle has been constructed. The people gave. It's a beautiful thing. All the furniture of the tabernacle is there. And what's significant at the close of Exodus is now the Spirit of God comes and dwells in the tabernacle. So what's significant about that? Before, when God communicated with Moses, Moses had to go outside the camp. But now the tabernacle is in the midst of the camp. God is right there. He's not just in the cloud that leads them by day and the fire that leads them. It's not like you just see God or see the effects of the smoke and the fire on the mountain because God's over there, but God's dwelling in the midst of them in the tabernacle. And that is a fearful thing for the people. How can we deal with, before we were told to stay away from this God because He was so holy. How do we have access to Him? How do we relate to Him? How do we have fellowship with Him without ourselves being consumed? God's presence filled the temple in the midst of the nation. So the key question taken up immediately after that, here in Leviticus chapter 1, is how would they, as a nation of sinful people, be able to commune with this God? How could they gain communion with God? How could sinful people draw near to a holy God and live? All this nation had to draw on were the records of their patriarchal fathers and their eyewitness of the Egyptians' worship and ritual of their gods. Their concept of worship and godly life was severely distorted. They needed God to teach them about access to Him. And God in His grace calls out to Moses and begins to answer this looming question. How can sinful people have an ongoing fellowship with a holy God? The key theme of Leviticus is yes, God is holy, and God's people also need to be holy. That's the big answer. Let's look at Leviticus chapter 1, begin to answer. And we'll look at 3 truths from this text as we begin to think about relating to a holy God, about man's ability to have access with that God. Again, our way to God, access is open. We've read verse 1 and 2. The Lord called to Moses. That, friends, is significant. The Lord spake to Moses out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, access comes through an offering. Access comes through an offering. So the first truth we want to understand from verses 1 and 2 is this. God invites us to come to Him. God invites us to come to Him. God wants us to have access. He wants fellowship with you. He wanted fellowship with His people. Now, let's not take that for granted. Now, some very notable people in American history, and world history for that matter, have believed that there was a Creator God, but that God was not a personal God. That God really didn't care about people. He kind of set the world in motion and took His hands off, and He has the right to interact with people, but He just doesn't, because He really doesn't care to. That's called deism, and it's actually making a comeback in our culture today when people think that about God. But the statement here in this passage that the Lord called to Moses, that occurs in its variations 38 times in the book of Leviticus. A similar understanding is that the Lord commanded or the Lord told Moses is found another 18 times. So for 56 times in the book of Leviticus, we are told that God spoke directly to Moses, to Aaron, and thus through Moses and Aaron to the people of God. God is communicating a way for us to come to Him. In the very first verse of Leviticus, it tells us the Lord called and spoke. In the very last verse of Leviticus, again, we're told that the Lord spoke these things to Moses at Mount Sinai. So don't take that for granted. But also understand this, Israel didn't have anything going for it. There was nothing that God looked from heaven and saw Israel and said, boy, I really want them to know me. They're just such a wonderful tribe of people. I mean, they've got so much going for them. No, what were they? They were a nation of slaves. They were a nation of people who had been bound up in Egypt. They had grown in number. But God had set His favor upon them. God was fulfilling a covenant and a promise that He made to Abraham. But there was nothing intrinsically about them that said, boy, they're like a perfect race of people. In fact, by the time we get to Leviticus chapter number 1, they've already proven that they're not really that perfect. They've already proven that they're not really that reliable. In fact, what we find here is that God is coming to a people who just recently, at Mount Sinai, they said, hey, we want to be in a covenant with God. So Moses goes back up the hill, and he gets more laws and legislation from God about how the people, and while he's up there, it kind of takes too long. So they break the first 2 commandments. Have no other God and don't make an image. They break the 2 big ones right there at Mount Sinai while Moses is talking with God. While God is giving Moses the instruction for how to build this tabernacle where God and man would meet together, God in His grace continues to give Moses those instructions. And God in His knowledge knows what's taking place down below in the mountain. He knows how rebellious these people are. He knows the fits that they have given and will give Moses. Yet God speaks in Leviticus chapter 1, after these episodes of rebellion and sin, and God says, I want you to come to me. There's a way for you to have access. Friends, that's grace, isn't it? That's God's grace on display. God is inviting this sinful nation made up of sinful people to come into His presence to worship Him with an offering. Burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, sin offering, guilt offering. In verse number 2, we see the word bring. Ye shall bring your offering of the cattle. I like this. That word bring in the Hebrew comes from the word that we get the idea of draw near. Brother Andrew just spent a couple of weeks talking to us out of Hebrews chapter 10 on Sunday nights about how we can draw near unto God. And that's the idea that through the bringing of this offering that we can draw near to Him. Access is open and God communicates. And the fact that God would communicate with sinful people, that He wants to have a relationship with them, is an act of His mercy and an act of His grace. Mercy in that God withholds the judgment that we rightly deserve, and grace in that God gives us something we don't deserve, and that's the opportunity to come to Him. He's saying, come and experience me. Come and have a relationship with me. Isaiah the prophet would pick up this wonderful truth when writing to a beleaguered, embattled, and imprisoned people. in the Babylonian captivity years later in Isaiah 55 when he would write, "Everyone that thirsts, come to the waters, and he that has no money, come and buy and eat. Yea, come, buy wine and milk without mercy and without price. Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness. Incline your ear, come unto me, hear, and your soul shall live." God allows people to come into His presence, but God only invites them on His terms. That's the second thing we need to understand from this. There is an invitation, and God initiates it, and He wants us to come into His presence and relate to Him, but only on His terms. So let's consider the offerings that are presented here in Leviticus chapter 1. Let's continue reading, all right? Verse 3, if his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. And he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted to him to make atonement for him. And he shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priest, Aaron's son, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood round about upon the altar. That is, by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into his pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire upon the altar, and lay the wood in order upon the fire. And the priest, Aaron's son, shall lay the parts, the head and the fat, in order upon the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar. But his inward parts and his legs shall he wash in water. The priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. Now we can continue reading. There are two other prescribed burnt offerings here in the passage. Verse number 10 talks about not just a cattle that's brought, but of a flock. So it would be a sheep or a goat. And then verse number 14 says the same thing about a bird, a turtle dove or a pigeon that would be brought as an offering. And it describes how that offering would be dispensed or carried out, the kind of the ritual acts of it. So let's consider this second truth from the passage we just read. Not only does God invite us into His presence, and that's good for us to know. God wants us to relate to Him. But consider this, God grants access only on the basis of a substitutionary sacrifice. Okay? So something has to die in order for us to have access to God. I know we don't necessarily use that word substitutionary, but it might be confusing to some. But it is, I think it's a vital word, so I wanted to put it here. And so if you're writing down this second point, please write that word in there. That God grants us access only on the basis of a substitutionary sacrifice. So we get access, but we only get access through this offering that's offered. Let's look at that offering. Well, first, in the basic sacrifice, the offering the worshiper would bring, it's called a burnt offering. What's special about this offering, whether it be of a bull or a sheep or a pigeon, is that the worshiper would bring this offering, granting him fellowship with God. It would be completely and wholly given to God. None of this offering was going to go to the priest. They weren't going to get any of the meat of it. None of it would be shared in a communal meal of worship like some other offerings. When we were thanking God or worshiping God, we'd bring an offering and all would share and we'd rejoice in God together. That's not the kind of offering this is. It was only for God. The word in the text for burnt is the word olah. And it comes from the word which means to arise. Probably because the smoke on the altar was continually arising up to God because of the burning on the altar. Later, that word is associated with another event in world history, the English word Holocaust. And why? Why was it associated? Why is that the same kind of main word? Because the act of genocide that occurred in the Holocaust involved a complete incineration or a continual burning. So one of these unique things about this offering was that it was completely burned before the Lord. It had no other purpose but to just be given to God. We could say it this way. To gain access to God, something had to be completely given to Him. Just for Him. And that's the prescription here. It's going to be completely given. This is sacrifice to the Lord. And God prescribes the manner of that sacrifice that could be brought. It could come from a herd, from a flock, it could come from a bird. Any would do. Now, why is that? Why wasn't there just one animal that would do it? Well, I think God in His grace, the invitation extended to all economic levels of the nation of Israel. Anybody could afford to bring one of these animals. And so for those who were impoverished or didn't have the means to bring a bull or cattle or that type of thing, they could still gain access to God if all they could offer, if all they could give was just a young pigeon. Now, the reality is there's always some sacrifice in our worship. Worship always involves sacrifice. And there's no legitimate claim to commitment to the Lord if there's no costly consecration to the Lord. But everybody could bring something. Everyone could offer. The sacrifice had to be without blemish. It's stated there about the cattle. It's stated about the flock. It had to be without blemish or perfect. It couldn't have any sickness in it. Why? Because the person was going to be placing their sin on it. There's a transferal of their guilt upon it. And so the animal had to come without its own faults. So you had to identify that kind of animal. Verse 4 is an important verse for our understanding of this whole process. The worshiper is to place his hand on the head of the offering. So you're coming with your sacrifice. Say you got a sheep. You're going to take this sheep, and one of the Levites or priests comes out to assist you in your offering, this burnt offering. You're fully aware of your sin. You recognize the holiness of God. You're bringing this offering. But you laid your hands on the head of the animal, the sheep that you were offering. Why? Well, it was this type of a symbolic transferal of guilt. Like, there's nothing wrong with this animal. This animal doesn't have any blemishes. The fault, the thing that's keeping me from God, lies with me, with my sin, with my heart condition. That's where the wrath of God is on me. But this animal is going to die in my place. And so I'm transferring, in a sense, my sin. And so the placing of the hands wasn't necessarily for everybody else watching as much as it was for the one worshiping. The one offering was saying, I recognize I should be the one paying for this, but this is the one that will pay for it. And place the hands on the head of that animal. Verse 5 and following tells us then the process that would occur. We see the heart attitude of the worshiper coming to God, bringing his offering. And by the way, can I just say this? That the attitude of the worshiper that just shows up and says, well, you know what, I just want to see God today, and I'm not too concerned about my sin. I'm not too concerned about, bringing an offering. I just want to gain access to God. Just to understand the tabernacle and the way it was laid out, you don't go to the Holy of Holies until you stop by the altar, the brazen altar. The first implement when you come into the tabernacle is this altar. You don't come to worship God empty-handed. You come with your offering. You come with your sacrifice. Because your sin keeps you from God. But the offering gives you access to Him. Verse 5 and following tells us the priest would take the blood and splash it on the altar. So as you cut the throat of that lamb, the priest would catch a portion of that blood, and he would take it to the altar, and he would splash the altar, the corners of the altar, with the blood of that animal. The priest then would help even quarter or cut that animal into pieces, and would then take the pieces and stack the pieces on the altar as it was being consumed and being burnt. Some of the parts of the animal were unclean just because of the part of the animal it was. It's a waste system. And so those parts of the animal, the priest would clean and wash and offer things that were clean and right to the Lord. So the consuming of the sacrifice would purge the worshiper, and the wrath of God was taken off of the one who came to worship God. And that individual who came with the offering was now free to be in the presence of God, or to enter the presence of God. Not to enter the Holy of Holies like the high priest would once a year at the Day of Atonement, but to be in that sense, have a right fellowship with God. The passage makes clear that both the blood and the body of the animal were surrendered on behalf of the person who came to worship. Maybe at this point you're asking, okay, Pastor, you said the second point was that God only grants access to him on his terms, and his terms was the substitutionary offering. Why? Why is that the case? Why did the sacrificial system involve the death of all these animals? And by the way, just think about that. For the sin that you have, you brought an animal. How many animals died in the life of one Israelite? And how many Israelites were there that wanted to be a God-fearer and be in fellowship with him? I mean, there were continual burnt offerings being made day and night. Why? Why is this the plan? Well, the answer comes all the way back in Genesis when God commanded the very first humans, Adam and Eve, the day you eat, you will die. God, in his wisdom, has prescribed a universal and timeless truth, unalterable truth. And that truth is this: sin brings death. Sin brings death. God laid down that principle from the very first of humanity, from the very first, even before the first sin. God communicated that reality. So coming to God meant, because they were sinners, they continually needed to appease the wrath of God. They had to come to God. Their sin had to be accounted for. Death had to take place. You would go live life, and you sin in living life. Well, you want to come to God and have a relationship with God? Death for sin had to take place. The purpose of this sacrifice was what we find in verse number 4, to make atonement for the worshiper. To make atonement for the worshiper. That word atonement is an important word for a Christian. It means to appease or pacify. Some would say it means to cover, but I think there's another Hebrew word that would more accurately indicate the idea of a covering. But it means just that the wrath of God was stopped. God's wrath was appeased. And Paul makes the argument for us in the New Testament in Romans chapter 4 that even prior to the law, people were justified, or God's wrath was taken off of them. Not just through this system and not just through the cross of Jesus Christ, but people are justified, or God's wrath was appeased. The psalmist was able to write in Psalm 78 that he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and destroyed them not. And the word forgave in Psalm 78 is the same word as the word atonement here in Leviticus chapter 1. That God's wrath was set off of them. We've been talking about forgiveness in our Sunday school classes, haven't we? About how God removes the sin as far as the east is from the west, and he sets it behind him, and he puts it in the sea of God's forgetfulness, is how we often phrase it. But the idea is that God doesn't bring it up. It's dealt with. His wrath is appeased. That's the word atonement. So, the person having his sin forgiven is cleansed from their impurities. God's wrath is settled. And they're at one with God, or they're reconciled to God. They have a relationship with God. They can have fellowship with God because the issue that divided them, their sin, has been dealt with. You remember in the garden, God walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. But when sin entered, there was a division. There was a division. Why? Because of sin. Well, the people that Moses was ministering to, God is giving them direction. You can have access, but death has to occur. for us to be at one with God, for us to have fellowship with God. So every time a worshiper brought an animal and killed it, and watched this priest sprinkle the blood on the altar, and cut the animal to pieces, and watch the body being burned, God was giving them a real, vivid demonstration of the fact, the unalterable, timely truth, that sin brings death. Now, what's sober is, it wasn't just the Israelites who sinned. What's sober is, friend, you and I also sin. And we're separated from God because of our sin. But isn't it awesome and wonderful that God has provided a sacrifice? Romans chapter 5, verse 10. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God, we were brought together with God. How? By the death of His Son. Because sin requires death. Someone had to die if you're going to have access to God. And if Christ doesn't die, friend, you don't have access to God. But Christ did. Much more, being reconciled, we shall be saved through His life. Romans chapter 6, verse 23 reminds us the gift of God, the wages of sin is what? It's death. But God gave us a gift. And the gift of God is eternal life, or access to God for all eternity. How? Through Jesus Christ, we have access to God. When we accept Jesus' death on the cross for our sin, then His death acts as a sufficient payment for our sin. Atonement, a substitutionary atonement, has been made available for you in the person Jesus Christ. Well, let me give you this last truth as our time is quickly leaving us. And that is this. It's not just that the offering of the animal, it wasn't just the religious act that enabled it. It wasn't just, speaking of Jesus Christ on the cross, it wasn't just the fact that Jesus died that we automatically have access to God. The passage here shows us that there's these offerings that we can bring to gain access to God. But we must understand that it is faith, not the ritual, that secures that fellowship with God. It is faith, not the ritual. This act of worship was a way of expressing publicly one's faith. This is what I'm trusting in. The fact that God is dwelling in this midst and I'm a sinner, the only way those two things can coexist is if I do what God has told me to do, and that is to bring this offering. I'm trusting in, I'm placing faith in what God has prescribed as the solution for my sin. Romans chapter 1, verse 17 reminds us that the just live by faith. The righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. So from generation to generation, it's always been this, that the just, or those that are right with God, do so or live by faith. Not by ritual, not by the work, but by faith. Forgiveness and purification were graciously given to God, by God, to the individuals who by faith submitted to Him and obeyed Him and followed what He prescribed, the bringing of this animal. Israel did not know at this time God's full plan of redemption. To say, well, they were bringing this animal because they knew that God was going to give His Son Jesus is not an accurate reality. Isaiah would begin to help people understand that the Messiah would come and He would sacrifice and be bruised and so forth. But Israel, at this point, just had to believe the knowledge that they were given, that God said, if you bring this burnt offering, we can dwell together. Now here's what's really awesome. As we relate this to our lives in the New Testament, at the end of each chapter, at the end of each prescription, verse number 9, I want you to look at that. It says that the offering was made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. In other words, the Lord accepted this faith of the individual as they brought this offering. Verse 10 through verse 13 tells us about the sheep, the same process they go through, laying on of hands, the killing, the quartering of the animal, the of the animal on the altar, the ram or the lamb being burned. And what was the response of God? It is a burning sacrifice, verse 13, an offering made by fire, and again, what? A sweet savor unto the Lord. Verse number 17. Again, the same thing with the bird, a little different procedure because there's not as much blood in a bird, but they'd wring the neck, pour it out, they'd crack open its backbone, spread its wings, show its utter dependency, and it would be offered on the fire to the Lord. It is burnt sacrifice, verse 17, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. God in His mercy allowed the sinful nation to come. At His invitation, He invited them to come. He made a way for all of them, anyone who wanted to, by faith, follow Him, could come and have access. The door was wide open. God didn't just simply accept the worshiper and the offering. God took pleasure in it. He took pleasure in the nation of Israel coming to Him with their offering and saying, God, we believe what you said, and we want to have fellowship with you. We know our sin has separated us from you, but you've made a way, and God received that act of faith and received pleasure from it. I think that's necessary for us as Christians to recognize. Because this side of the cross, we go, yes, Jesus, the substitutionary atonement, He did that for us. Now, why do we need to live for Him? Because God delights in our fellowship with Him. Paul said it this way in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. Whether we live or die, my goal is this, to be well-pleasing unto God, to be accepted unto God, that God would delight in my life. How would that be made possible? Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2, speaking again of Jesus Christ. Be ye therefore followers of God as dear children. Hey, church, how you live is important. Follow God as dear children. Walk in love. Walk in love. We're commanded. Why? Listen, as Christ also has loved us. How did He do it? He has given Himself as an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor. Paul said, all those offerings God received as a sweet-smelling savor. Well, Jesus Christ gave Himself. And God delighted in the offering of His Son, Jesus. He is well pleased with that and who He is and what He did and that act of love. And so, Christian, imitate Jesus, and your life will be a sweet offering to God. We can't pay for our sin. We can't, in our own good merits and good grace, accomplish access to God. You don't get heaven because you're good. Went on vacation with my family, and we wanted to go to a certain theme park, a certain amusement park there in Virginia. And man, my son was really excited. He was watching all the YouTube videos of all the roller coasters, but I didn't have it in my vacation budget to take all 6 of us. We were trying to think about, well, how can we do that? And someone found out that our family was going on vacation and had talked to me about some of the things I was planning to do on vacation and that was an option. Well, before we left on vacation, they came and they handed me a check. And the check was enough money to take all of my family to that amusement park. Without that sacrifice, without that gift, we wouldn't have gained entrance. I didn't have it within my budget to take my family to that. We did a lot of fun things, don't get me wrong, we had a great time. But somebody sacrificed so our family could gain entrance Friend, if you're here today and you don't fully understand what Jesus Christ did for you, I want you to know something. Just to put it as simple as possible. He gave what was required. He gave himself as the perfect, spotless, without blemish lamb so that you could have access to God. Can I just say, friend, this morning, just knowing that doesn't save you. Just like the worshiper in Leviticus, you have to come and claim Jesus' death for yourself. You have to lay hold of that and say, my faith is exactly in Jesus' death. It's not in anything else. Jesus has given you access to God, but you must claim it by faith.